Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Don Owens, and we'll be here talking today about a couple of new SDKs that we have in the Marketing Cloud. Before we get started, though, we always show our forward-looking statement. We are a publicly traded company, so just please make sure that you make any purchasing decisions based on products that are in market and not something that we may show you that hasn't been released yet. So like I said, I'm Don, and what we're going to do first is we're going to talk about our new Content Block SDK. Then we have a full agenda. We'll have a couple of demos after that. And so what is the Marketing Cloud SDK, the Content Block SDK? So this is a way for services teams and customers and partners to build their own blocks for our email editor. And so this is, we have 3 ISV launch partners that are part of this, Movable Ink, LiveClicker, and Pixley, and they are working on blocks that will be available soon. And so for those who may not be familiar with Content Builder, let's do a quick demo of what are we talking about when we talk about content blocks. So I'm editing an email here in Content Builder, and blocks are these editing widgets for different types of content that we can add to an email. So to do that, I can drag, say if I want an image, I can drag an image over here and drop it into place, select an image that I already have in Content Builder, upload one, all of that. And then what we're talking about today is the ability to build custom blocks. So for functionality that we don't provide, or maybe to integrate with an outside content system, we have this tool set now to build custom blocks. So we have one here that's just a demo, that's just a different type of text editor than we provide. It's a quill block. And the way this works is anytime I type something, this updates in real time, just like any other, any block that we provide. And so that's what we're going to demo today. We're going to talk about building one. So, Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Don. All right, let's start with a little bit of an architecture diagram, and actually before that even, let's start with some terminology. We use the word block to designate 2 things that are actually somewhat different. If you look at this picture, on the right you have the editor, and what we call the content block is the piece of HTML content that we put in the email inside a slot, and that is then sent. So the content block is what lives with the email and is what is sent to a subscriber. On the other side, the experience that lets a marketer edit that content block is called the block widget. And when we say custom blocks, we mean custom block widgets that then allow marketers to create content blocks with it. So this diagram shows what the Block SDK actually provides. The Block SDK lets a custom block widget communicate with the editor, as opposed to a lot of SDKs that are wrapping around API calls, REST calls, SOAP calls, etc. The Block SDK actually wraps around cross-document messaging, which means the SDK lets a piece of UI in your browser talk to the editor UI in your browser as well without going server-side. So it's very quick, and that's what we can do as you type real-time interactions. The Block widget is built by third parties, partners, customers, etc., and is hosted separately. It's hosted on its own app, and it can make its own API calls to a third-party app, third-party API. But also, if that app that's hosting the Block widget is a Marketing Cloud App Exchange app, it could also make API calls to the Marketing Cloud. But none of that is managed by the Block SDK. That is managed by the other SDKs or direct REST calls to the Marketing Cloud API. So the Block SDK is really about talking to the editor and then saving that block, sending that block, etc. That's at the discretion of the user on the Marketing Cloud side. So we're going to go through a series of resources that we offer to help out developing custom block widgets. The first one is the actual SDK. So we have the SDK in 2 formats. We have a node module that you can install through NPM, or we have a GitHub repo with all the actual code. Let's go to that really quick. And in that repository, you have a little installation instruction. It's pretty straightforward. You can pull it as a tag, or you can install it through NPM. What it really provides is a set of 5 methods. I'm going to go through them really quick. They're pretty straightforward. Obviously, you want to set the HTML content of that block. So we have a method called setContent. And when you call setContent, you pass it a string, and that's going to be the HTML for this block. It is whitelisted against a series of secure tags and attributes to prevent malicious code from making it into the email. But otherwise, it's a pass-through. And then we have getContent, which allows you to get the current content of that block as well. We also offer a custom property bag that we call data, so you can set some data or get some data. That data lives in a JSON format with the block and is persisted with the block or the email. So if the user saves the email and later opens it up, your block gets invoked. You can re-access the data you had saved for that block in that email. And then we have an additional attribute that is worth mentioning, which is super content. When you develop custom blocks, you'll often find that you may have custom scripting. You could use, for instance, mscript, or have conditional expressions in there that are for send time. So at send time, we would think if the customer has this attribute, send that, otherwise send this, which doesn't look very good. So instead, you may want to show something like an example of what it would look like, which is what super content is about. So when you want to set content and that content is not good to look at, you can also set super content to display that instead. And we'll see an example in a bit. So now, going back to the architecture really quick, the block widget that you are building, the custom block, is in its simplest form just an HTML page. An HTML page that invokes the Block SDK. So when you develop locally, you may want to quickly check if your HTML page has instantiated the SDK properly, if what you want to do with it works, etc., without having to provision that into the editor and create an email and go through a bit more advanced process of testing that on prod. So we offer this little Heroku app called blocktester.herokuapp.com. It's actually very secure. Don't believe this. This is because we want to test against localhost. So we have to simplify the security settings there. But the concept of this is on the left side, very much like on the left side of the editor, we're going to iframe any block URL that you want. And then it's going to show you the result that it would show in the editor on the right side. So in here, I'm going to use the same block that Don demoed, the Quill.js block. And if I click here, it shows me the Quill.js block. And as I type, it updates the content of this block. And then I can try another block, and I can see what 2 blocks can do in parallel. I go back to the first one, it loads its content, etc. It also shows you what would happen when you do get data and set data. So it's a little dev environment accelerator for building blocks. So now that we've seen those 2 tools, let's go ahead and actually build an actual block and try and see if we can, build it, use it in the editor, etc. The concept for this block is Google Maps. We have a limitation in emails that we can only have images. We cannot have an iframe or some kind of JavaScript that would show Google Map, for instance. So in this case, the idea is we're going to use the Google API to generate some image that represents a map and show that in an email. So let's get started here. I'm going to make a directory called TDX SDK block. And I'm going to create an npm vanilla repo. Here we go. And I'm going to install just 3 things. One is obviously the Block SDK, because that's what we need to talk to the editor. I'm going to install Lightning Design Systems, because I want to have my block look good and look consistent with the rest of the editor and the rest of the Salesforce ecosystem. And I'm also going to install Express, which is just a simple web server, because in that case, I'm just going to statically serve my block. So I said Express, Block SDK, and design system. So it's installing this. Wasn't too long. Okay, now let's go to an editor and take a look at what we've got. So we've got an SDK block here with the node modules installed and a package JSON. Now I'm going to copy over very few files there that are the UI for the block. That obviously I'm not going to code an entire UI in 10 minutes. So let's copy over a server file, and that's the most basic express, let's just serve this static content file. And then let's copy over as well a simple set of 2 icons that are used by the editor to display the block that you can drag and drop into a slot in the editing experience, and an index file and a JS file. So let's really quickly go through the index file. It looks very complicated, but really it is a straightforward copy-paste from the Lightning Design System page, a few fields, a few sliders. I'm copy-pasting that into my HTML file, and then really the magic happens in the main file, and we're going to go through that really quick, where the actual code starts. So what this main file is doing here is it's getting the SDK, it's instantiating it, then it's adding a few classic UI functionality, a debounce function, so that it doesn't set the content every second or every hundredths of a second. Actually, it sets it every half a second. The ability to paint the settings in the UI, the ability to generate that actual map image, all of that's relatively straightforward. And then when the block opens up, so when the editor decides that your block is needed and iframes it inside the left side, it does a get data. So it gets the data of the block. If there is no data yet, it gets nothing, and it knows it's a new block. If there is data already, it knows there's a block already saved in there. So it sets the address, the width and the height of the image, the zoom level, and the link for it, and then paints everything. And then additionally, we add an event listener, which is when any of those settings change, we want to redraw the image and save all the information. So if the function paint slider value, which is then paints the map, I have set content and set data that are called. I'm setting the content, which we're going to see in a moment, and I'm setting the actual data so I can save this information. Note that it's a bit redundant. If you set the content, you already have all those attributes handy. It's just much simpler to read it from like a JSON object where it's all structured properly than having to pass your HTML back and forth. So I definitely recommend using data rather than content as your store there. So now that we have that, let's see. So I'm in my block. Let's start this. And I'm going to use the block tester app to see what it looks like. Oh, actually, let me refresh that because we have data already in those blocks. That would probably not play nice. All right. And it works. So now I have, this is pretty much the HTML and the JavaScript file that I just described. So we have a Google Maps block with a few sliders to do image width, image height, etc., and a location. I don't render before there is a location because I don't really know what arbitrary location I would put here, but let's do Moscone West. And here we have an image generated on the side. So as I type, the block is calling set content with this new image that it generates, and I can change some attributes like the height. Actually, let's make it fit. Here we go, the width. And I can optionally put a link wrap to have the image redirect somewhere. So now that we've tested that locally it works, the next step in actually having a block is to host it somewhere that's publicly accessible. Right now it's on localhost. So really the quickest way to get something up and running would be to just start something on Heroku. I'm going to create a new app in my personal account. Let's call it TDX Block SDK and create. I'm not paid by Heroku to say this, but really the offering a GitHub repo there that you just push to and it deploys makes it ridiculously convenient for simple code bases like a custom block. So in here, I'm going to get my Git URL, and going back to my terminal, now that I see it works locally, I'm just going to start making it a Git repo, adding my Heroku remote, and then adding everything. Okay, committing everything. Initial commits. And then pushing to Heroku, which will trigger a release. It should take only a few seconds. And now that it's up on Heroku, almost, I can go and get the actual URL for my app. Here we go. So it hasn't deployed yet. Now it's deployed. And within a few seconds, here we go. Okay, so it doesn't look like much because it's not meant to display in this environment, but if I'm copying this URL and trying it in the block tester, in here, I should have virtually the same experience. So I'm going to leave my old block on the left and edit the right one, and here we go, and now I can do maybe Salesforce Tower. Here we go. So it's really the same experience, but this time it's actually on Heroku, right? So now that I have this new block that I made up and running on Heroku, seems to be working in the block tester. The next step is what does it look like in the actual Marketing Cloud editor. So I'm going to let Don come and provision the editor with that block and test it.
All right, thanks, Thomas. So yeah, so as Thomas said, now we want to use this block actually in the Marketing Cloud. And the way we do that, there's a couple ways that blocks get deployed. If it's a partner, an ISV partner that builds a block that they want to distribute and sell, it goes through the App Exchange. The App Exchange process will ultimately put the block in a package here. So we have this concept of installed packages in the Marketing Cloud. And so I've already created a custom blocks package, and that's where that Quill block that I showed earlier is sitting. And so I want to add the package that, or the block that Thomas just created. So I add a component here. We see we have a few types, and I want a custom content block. And so all I need to do is give it a title. We'll call it a Google Map, and put in the URL of the Heroku app that Thomas just created. And pretty simple, it's there now. And so if I go back to my email that I was showing earlier, I'll exit and refresh the page to get that loaded. Okay, just another second, and I open that email again. And we should see our Google Maps block in here, and it's there. And so just like Thomas was showing in the test app, I drop it into an editable part of my email, and I see this block there. I enter a place. You can enter, it's Google Maps, so you can enter an actual address, a landmark name. I'm going to put in Salesforce Tower, Indianapolis, which is where I work. And it's showing me a map of Indianapolis with the Salesforce Tower in there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Sanjay.
Thanks, Don. I'll have to move this a little bit and plug in my stuff. Thank you very much. Give me just 1 minute, folks. I'm almost there. I'll start with the traditional slide. So my name is Sanjay Nagmangalam. I'm a product manager in the Marketing Cloud team. And what I wanted to show you today or share with you today is essentially a sneak peek at some of the early thinking that we are doing to make it easy for developers and ISVs to get started writing apps for the Marketing Cloud. I don't have any slides. That's my only slide. So what I'm going to do is basically switch over to the demo. Okay. So what you see in front of you is a prototype of, an early prototype of a get started experience, right? I'm going to show you two scenarios. The first is targeted at if you're a developer with an existing Marketing Cloud account, what would you do? How would you start? And the second is, imagine if you will, that you don't have a Marketing Cloud account and you simply want to try stuff. What would you do then, right? So go with my story here. So imagine you have an existing Marketing Cloud account, you have a client ID and secret that's been pre-provisioned for you, and you're a Java developer who happens to use the Mac OS, right? So that's the demo I'll go do. I'll click Java Mac OS, and what comes in front of you is a three-step process, right? I mean, the first step essentially says, hey, here's how you go set up your environment. Now, since you're a Java developer on the Mac OS, chances are you probably use Homebrew. So these steps walk you through installing Brew itself, installing Java with Brew, and installing Maven. I mean, most Java folks use Apache Maven to create projects and build projects, right? So one time, you kind of have to set your dev environment just once. To save time for this demo, I've already done this on my MacBook, right? So you won't have to do this again. So I can go to step 2. Now, step 2 walks you through essentially the steps to create a Maven project and add a reference to the Marketing Cloud Java SDKs. Now, Marketing Cloud has SDKs in 6 languages. Java is one of them. C# is another, and so on and so forth. So what I'll do is, I mean, I don't want to type all of this. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hover over this terminal window, hit copy, open up a terminal window on my Mac. I hope you can see that. I can make it a little bit bigger. And I'm going to hit paste. Right, so that's the Maven command, standard Maven command to create an empty archetype. So what Maven's doing is it's creating an empty Java project. It's going to have a pom.xml there and an empty app.java. So at this point, I have an empty Maven project created, ready for me to go. I'll try and change directories to that. So that's my project that just got created. Cool, now what do I do next? The next order of business is to go add a reference to the Marketing Cloud Java SDK. So Maven has this notion of a pom.xml. Essentially, it's a project file. And these lines here add a dependency to the Java SDK, Marketing Cloud Java SDK. Like before, I'm going to hit copy. But before I do that, I can actually go and open up my project in my favorite editor. Any editor would do. So I'm going to open my Java project like so. And I have my super duper pom.xml. There's nothing much there, so I'm going to go get rid of it. And I'll paste over what I copied from the get started guide. Let's save. Sure, go compile your dependencies. So now I have an empty Java project with an empty app.java, if you will. But the pom.xml has a reference to the Marketing Cloud SDK. Okay, what next? I'm ready to write my Java app, my first Java app. So I can go to step 3. And step 3 essentially says, hey, you're an existing Marketing Cloud customer, so you're going to need this API secret, client ID and client secret. And the app itself is very, very simple. The app essentially uses the API key to connect to Marketing Cloud and say, great, I connected, right? So like before, I'm going to go hit copy, go back to my editor, open app.java. There's nothing there, as you can see. I'm going to get rid of this guy and hit paste. So simple app. I still have to replace these with mine, right? So I've actually set up a client ID and secret locally on my MacBook. So I'm simply going to copy that over and replace that. So now I'm going to read this app.java will read the client ID and secret from my local MacBook environment variables. Cool. I'm ready to compile the app. Okay, how do I do that? Go back to the getting started. And 2 commands, essentially one to compile, one to run. So the first one, I'll simply copy the mvn clean package, go back to my handy-dandy terminal, hit paste, and now it's compiling. Right, so just in a few minutes, the getting started experience tutorial essentially walked you through 2 steps. Right? Time to run it. Let me go run it. I'll hit copy here and hit paste there. And now it's actually running it. right? So again, simple demo. It's connecting to the Marketing Cloud now. Hopefully it will connect, and it printed that all done message, right? So from start to finish in less than what, a minute, maybe 2 minutes, right? Copy, paste. Now, the thing we are doing with, we have examples of a slightly more complex app as well, which creates an email, sends the email via triggered send, check status, and that kind of thing. So the point here, the goal here in showing you this was, it's an early prototype, and we actually are looking for feedback, right, on whether you like what you see, you don't like what you see, how can we go improve, what other ideas we can go incorporate. So all feedback is welcome. So now that was the first scenario. I'll quickly show you the second scenario as well. I'll head back to my home page. And this scenario targets folks or developers who do not have a Marketing Cloud account, right? So how would they try out or look at examples of a Java app, for example? So I'd like to introduce the notion of what we've been toying with, something that we call an SDK playground. So I'll show you a Java SDK playground. Looks very, very similar to the example that I showed you before. However, think of the Marketing Cloud SDK playground as your dev environment in the cloud for Marketing Cloud, right? So it uses pre-provisioned accounts. It uses a pre-provisioned API key and secret. And what it does is it enables you to try out your app in various languages right within the browser. You don't need to install anything now, right? So what I'm going to show you is I'll run the same commands that I ran before in the terminal, but this time I'm going to simply click Run command to run that same Maven create project command in the playground. So let me go do that. So that command's actually running Maven in the playground. It will create an empty project shortly. Give it just 1 second. So the playground itself runs on Heroku. So it's hosted on Heroku, or the prototype is. And then in the coming months, we'll actually solidify it up and productize it based on your feedback and tweaks and stuff. So come on. And given it's a free dyno, it takes a little bit of time. Okay, this is taking a little longer than I thought it would. Okay, fine. So Heroku took time. So empty project created, and the same deal, right? So it's got the pom.xml. It's already added the reference to the Java SDK, and it's got that empty app.java, all waiting in the playground for step 2. Step 2, same app as before, but if you notice, I'm actually not giving it any API key or secret, because the Java code I have here, the snippet I have here, simply picks up the API key and secret from the playground, right? In which case, when I click compile and run Java app, what the playground does is it takes this app.java and it copies it over to the Maven project. And it runs Maven, the 2 commands I showed you before, to compile the Java app, the Maven project, and run it. So it's actually compiling now. After it compiles, it shall run in a moment. Give me just 1 second. This will be a lot faster after we beef it up. Right? So bear with me, it's a prototype. So the key principle behind this thing is because the playground uses pre-provisioned API keys and client secrets, we have the opportunity to essentially make the playground round-robin rotate on those API keys, right? So there's been a long-standing ask from customers for a developer edition of Marketing Cloud. Now, it is certainly on our future long-term roadmap, but it's going to take us some time to get there. So the playground, the SDK playground, is essentially an attempt at a baby step for us to get there to achieve the same scenario, right? So that's the premise behind the playground. So as you can see, Maven compiled successfully. There's not much to compile. It's actually running it now. And the output will be the same as it's the same app. So it's going to simply try and connect to Marketing Cloud using those pre-provisioned API keys and essentially print a hello world. The difference is it's the playground running in Heroku that's connecting to Marketing Cloud versus the app that I ran earlier locally on my laptop that was connecting to Marketing. So different ways of connecting. The way to connect, again, is standard API calls, very well documented, so there's no surprises here. So yeah, there it is. It ran, it said I connected, and exited the playground. We have an example of an advanced app as well, just for kicks. And this app actually does something more end-to-end. Essentially, well, first I'll prove I'm not a robot, CAPTCHA check, and I'll give it an email. And what this app does, the simple app does, is it again gets the client ID and secret from the playground. It replaces this variable with the email address that I just entered. And then it creates an ET configuration, it creates an ET client, an ET email, then it creates an ET triggered send. Right? All of these are Java classes available in our Java SDK. And then it uses the triggered send to send the email. And finally, it catches the right exceptions. So the other advantage of this thing is it encourages best practices, right? Hey, here's how you catch the exception. Here's the exception you catch. Here's how you handle it. If you want to go retry, it helps us encourage those kind of best practices. It sends the email, and finally, it says it reports status. So it uses a method in the Java SDK to go report status. So I'll go run this. It'll take a little bit of time, but the point is, you can run a simple app, you can run a Java app. Imagine, if you will, that someday in the future, this console window, this text editor window, is something somewhere you could type, right? Kind of like in Heroku, right? So I mean, those are some of the ideas we are toying with. So it'll go do its thing. The point of this playground, or the point of this thing, is it addresses both sets of customers. Customers who have an existing Marketing Cloud account, who have an API key, they can copy, paste, get started, tweak. And this is for customers who don't have a Marketing Cloud account and want to try it out, right? You can imagine a similar set of playgrounds for C#, for Node.js, for Java, right? I mean, and then on the first scenario, we are actually talking to the Trailhead folks, where we could turn all of those copy, paste, type into your terminal kinds of examples into Trailhead modules. So I mean, go copy, paste, create a Maven project, 100 points, and so on and so forth, right? So it becomes an educational tool as well and helps people get started. Okay, so that was the demo. I'll go back to my presentation. And before I go to Q&A, I kind of want to make a pitch for Connections. So we are going to be at Connections as well in June. So we actually would love it if you folks come and join us. We'll go a lot deeper in all things developer experiences as well. And that was it. Thank you very much, and I'll open it for questions. So questions, comments, feedback?
Sir, please.
So this is just a general question. My Marketing Cloud looks a lot different than the one you were using. So did you change? Is that a new release? What's the deal?
Yeah, that's the release that's coming April 21st. We get it pre-production.
So is it a Lightning release, or kind of looks like Lightning?
It's a Lightning look and feel. Yeah, it's not full Lightning yet, by any means.
So why would I want Java or Ruby or anything in a Marketing Cloud email? I miss the whole context of why.
So imagine, if you will, that you were an ISV. So the question was, why would I use Java or Ruby or something else in a Marketing Cloud email? So imagine, if you will, that you were an ISV who wanted to do integrations from outside the Marketing Cloud, right? And let's say the developers in your team use Java, so they're familiar with Java. So then the question is, how would you use Java to interact with the Marketing Cloud from outside the Marketing Cloud? Say you had a business process within your company where you wanted to send and trigger a journey on a certain business process, right? How would your Java developer go do that? And the answer is they would use one or more of our SDKs. We have an SDK in Java. It's a language that your developers are familiar with, for example. and it makes it a lot easier to interact with the Marketing Cloud instead of using APIs. Right? So you have first-class Java classes that you can new up and work with them as you normally would. So essentially, it's reaching developers where they are. Right? So if you're comfortable using APIs, beautiful. On the other hand, if you're comfortable using Java, great. We have an SDK for that too. So that's the use case. Okay. More questions? Yes.
Could you leverage the existing Marketing Cloud API to, instead of build something out with AmpScript, build this out with one of the SDKs?
So the question was, could you use the Marketing Cloud APIs to, instead of building something with AmpScript, could they use the APIs? So the short answer is yes, but it does depend on the scenario. Right? So AmpScript is pretty powerful, and it can manipulate dynamic content in wonderful ways. APIs, on the other hand, are ideal for things like instantiating or starting journeys, for example, or loading data, or getting status, or creating objects. So it does depend on the scenario, is the short answer. If you have a specific use case, we can speak after, and I can help.
A general question.
Yes, Venkat.
Are lists going away, getting replaced by data extensions?
So the question was, are lists going away and getting replaced by data extensions? I do not know.
No.
No.
Nope.
Fine.
They're not going anywhere. Yeah.
Okay, so the question was, do we have sandboxes planned for Marketing Cloud? So sandboxes, aka Developer Edition, aka, long-term future roadmap, yes. However, it's going to take us time to go do that, right? And baby steps such as the playground that I just showed you, the example I showed you was the SDK playground. You could imagine the same concept of using pre-provisioned accounts, right, that are available to you for free, if you will, for a development environment, to solve those same scenarios, or to address a subset of those same scenarios as well. So the idea is to unblock folks like you sooner than later, right? We don't want you to wait until the DE comes along. Until then, we want to go enable some scenarios that are interesting to you.
But in terms of the timeline, what are we looking at?
Don't know. Don't know.